Nothing quite says interspecies diplomacy, like a full-blown security alert at 3 in the morning, ship time. Zephyr had been enjoying a perfectly reasonable cup of synthetic coffee and contemplating the beautiful simplicity of a malfunctioning air recycler when the alarm klaxons decided to shatter her peaceful moment into 1,000 ear-splitting pieces. All hands to emergency stations. Code Amber. Repeat. Code Amber. Missing persons protocol initiated. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Zephyr nearly choked on her coffee. Missing persons? On a sealed research vessel floating in the middle of absolutely nowhere? She set down her mug with the kind of deliberate calm that usually preceded either profound wisdom or spectacular sarcasm. Given her track record, smart money was on sarcasm. The Nexus Dawn had been humanity's pride and joy when it launched, a gleaming testament to what happened when you convinced a dozen different species that working together might be slightly more profitable than blowing each other up. The ship stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, with sections designed to accommodate everything from the Threx's preference for humid, hive-like chambers to the Gorvani's need for partially flooded quarters. It was, in Zephyr's professional opinion, a magnificent feat of engineering and a logistical nightmare wrapped in shiny metal and good intentions. As the ship's primary maintenance engineer, Zephyr had crawled through more ventilation shafts, rewired more power conduits, and fixed more impossible problems than she cared to count. She knew every bolt, every circuit, every quirky little spot where the artificial gravity flickered just enough to make your coffee float. If something was missing on this ship, it wasn't hiding in some secret compartment she didn't know about. The corridor outside her quarters had transformed into organized chaos. Crew members from half a dozen species hurried past, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that would have made a linguistic computer weep. The Threx clicked and buzzed in their rapid-fire hive speak, while the Gorvani's subsonic humming made the deck plates vibrate under Zephyr's feet. But it was the sound coming from the Velnari quarters that made her pause. Commander Gaxmol's roar could have peeled paint. The Velnari were impressive enough under normal circumstances. Picture a bipedal leopard that had been hitting the gym religiously and had strong opinions about honor, combat, and the proper way to sharpen claws. Now picture that same creature in the grip of pure, undiluted panic. Zephyr made her way toward the commotion, dodging a particularly frazzled Threx drone that seemed to be having an animated argument with a maintenance panel. The Velnari delegation quarters were in the ship's midsection, designed with the slightly higher gravity and warmer temperatures their species preferred. The smell hit her first, that distinctive musky scent that all the cat-like aliens seemed to carry, now overlaid with the sharp tang of fear sweat. Commander Gaxmol stood in the center of what could only be described as a crime scene, if the crime in question was extreme tidiness disruption. His golden fur was standing on end, making his already impressive frame look even more formidable. His emerald eyes swept the room with the intensity of a predator searching for threats, and his retractable claws were definitely not retracted. "Gone," he rumbled in heavily accented standard. His voice carried the kind of bass resonance that could probably crack hull plating if he really put his mind to it. "Wix and Flux, they are gone, vanished like smoke in the wind." Dr. Umbra was crouched beside one of the sleeping alcoves, running a handheld scanner over the disturbed bedding. Her dark hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and she wore the expression of someone who had been dragged from sleep to deal with a crisis that made absolutely no scientific sense. "No signs of struggle," she reported, her voice tight with concentration. "No foreign DNA traces, no evidence of forced entry. The atmospheric readings are completely normal. It's as if they just left. Left to go where?" Commander Gaxamol's tail lashed behind him, a clear sign of agitation in Velnari body language. "This is a ship in the void. There is nowhere to go." Zephyr leaned against the doorframe and watched the scene unfold with the kind of detached interest usually reserved for particularly entertaining holovids. She had to admit, there was something almost impressive about the way everyone had immediately jumped to the most dramatic possible explanations. Pirates, interdimensional rifts, spontaneous teleportation. The fact that two teenagers might have simply wandered off apparently hadn't occurred to anyone. Of course, these weren't exactly ordinary teenagers. Wix and Flux were Velnari cubs, adolescents in their species terms, but with all the physical capabilities of adult predators and approximately the same decision-making skills as any other youngster in the galaxy. They were also about as far from home as it was possible to get without leaving the galaxy entirely. "The bioscanners," Commander Gaxmol continued, his voice rising, "they show nothing. It is as if my cubs have ceased to exist." "That's not possible," Dr. Umbra said firmly. "Biosignatures don't just disappear. They might be masked or dampened somehow, but they don't vanish completely unless—" She trailed off, apparently not wanting to voice the obvious conclusion. "Unless they're dead," Zephyr supplied helpfully. The room went very, very quiet. Even the ship's background hum seemed to soften in the sudden silence. Commander Gaxmol's head snapped toward her, his predator's gaze fixing on her with uncomfortable intensity. "You think my cubs are dead, human?" Zephyr pushed off from the doorframe and stepped into the room, completely unbothered by the fact that she was now within easy, striking distance of a panicked alien warrior who could probably rearrange her internal organs without breaking a sweat. "I think your cubs are fine," she said, her tone as dry as recycled air. "I also think everyone in this room is overthinking this to a degree that would be impressive if it weren't so ridiculous." The silence stretched even thinner. Dr. Umbra looked up from her scanner with wide eyes. A Threx security officer who had been examining the ventilation grate ceased its clicking entirely. Even the ship's environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. "Explain," Commander Gaxmol growled. Zephyr pulled out her own scanner, a battered, practical device that had seen more action than most military equipment. She ran it over the same areas Dr. Umbra had checked, then expanded the sweep to cover the entire room. The readings were subtle, but they were there. "Your cubs didn't vanish," she said, studying the display. "They left. On their own, under their own power, without any external coercion whatsoever. The biosignatures are faint because they're not in this section of the ship anymore, but they're still aboard. The scanners are just having trouble pinpointing them because—" She paused, running a few quick calculations in her head. "Because they're somewhere the sensors weren't designed to look very carefully." "That is impossible," the Threx security officer buzzed. "All sections of the ship are monitored." "All biosignatures are tracked continuously." "All official sections," Zephyr corrected. "All expected locations. But how many of you have ever actually crawled through the maintenance shafts? How many of you know about the gaps between bulkheads where the artificial gravity generators create sensor shadows?" The room erupted in a fresh wave of chatter as everyone began talking at once. Commander Gaxmol raised one massive hand and the noise cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. "You believe they are hiding somewhere in the ship's infrastructure," he said. It wasn't really a question. I believe they're exactly where two scared kids would go when they're in an unfamiliar place and looking for somewhere that feels safe, Zephyr replied. The question isn't where they went. The question is why they felt they needed to go anywhere at all. Commander Gaxmol's expression shifted, confusion replacing panic. They were not in danger. Their quarters are secure, temperature-controlled, fitted with every comfort. Why would they leave? Zephyr looked around the room, at the sterile walls, the regulation furniture, the complete absence of anything that might feel like home to two young aliens who were probably homesick, scared, and trying very hard not to show it. Because sometimes safe and comfortable aren't the same thing, she said quietly. And sometimes, when you're far from home and everything smells wrong and sounds wrong, you go looking for something that feels right. The ship shuddered slightly as the IE main engines adjusted course, a routine maneuver that happened dozens of times each day. But in the Velnari quarters, surrounded by the tension and fear and growing panic of the adult crew members, it felt like an omen. Somewhere on the Nexus Dawn, two young Velnari were hiding. The question was whether they were hiding from something or looking for something. Zephyr had a pretty good idea which one it was, and if she was right, this was going to get interesting very quickly. If Zephyr had thought the initial panic was impressive, the full-scale search operation that followed was nothing short of spectacular. Within 30 minutes of her suggestion that the Cubs might be hiding in the ship's infrastructure, the Nexus Dawn had transformed into something resembling a military operation crossed with a nature documentary and seasoned with just a pinch of barely controlled hysteria. The Threx had mobilized their entire hive mind network, sending drones scuttling through every air vent, access tunnel, and maintenance corridor in the ship. Their clicking communications had reached a fever pitch that made conversation nearly impossible in some sections. Zephyr watched a team of 6 drones emerge from a ventilation grate near the mess hall, their antennae twitching as they analyzed chemical traces with the dedication of sommeliers evaluating vintage wine. Pheromone detection at maximum sensitivity, their collective spokesperson announced to anyone within hearing range. No Velnari adolescent markers detected in sectors 12 through 18. Expanding search parameters. The Gorvani had taken a different approach entirely. They had flooded several of the lower corridors with a thin layer of water and were using their natural echolocation abilities to map every hollow space in the ship's superstructure. The sound was oddly soothing, like being inside a very large, very alien whale. But the results were just as fruitless. Negative contact on subsonic sweep, one of the aquatic aliens reported, their voice carrying the wet, gurgling quality that came from speaking through modified gills. Structure is sound. No unauthorized voids detected. Commander Gaxmol prowled through it all like a caged predator, his massive frame somehow managing to be everywhere at once. He had shed his diplomatic robes in favor of what Zephyr could only describe as tactical gear, form-fitting armor that enhanced his already impressive physique and made his claws look even more lethal than usual. His golden fur had darkened to a deep amber, a stress response that made him blend into the ship's shadows with unnerving effectiveness. Anything, he growled at each search team in turn, any trace, any scent, any sign they passed through your sectors. The answers were always the same. Nothing. Negative. No contact. Dr. Umbra had set up a mobile command center in the main corridor, surrounded by enough scanning equipment to outfit a small scientific expedition. She moved between displays with the frantic energy of someone who was watching their carefully ordered universe collapse into chaos. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, adjusting the parameters on yet another sensor array. Biosignatures don't just disappear. Even if they were hiding in the deepest maintenance shafts, we should be detecting something. Heat signatures, carbon dioxide levels, electromagnetic patterns from their neural activity. Something. Maybe they're not hiding, suggested Lieutenant Vora, a tall, willowy alien from the Kethari delegation. Her species resembled what would happen if you crossed a human with a praying mantis and then taught the result proper table manners. Maybe they were taken. The word taken rippled through the assembled crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Conversations stopped. Search activities paused. Even the Threx drones seemed to hesitate in their endless scuttling. Taken by who? Dr. Umbra asked, though her voice suggested she really didn't want to hear the answer. Pirates, Lieutenant Vora said, with the confidence of someone who had clearly given this considerable thought. They could have used stealth technology to board the ship, bypassed our security systems, and extracted the cubs without triggering any alarms. In the middle of interstellar space, Zephyr interjected from her position against the wall. She had been content to watch the chaos unfold, but the conversation was veering into territory that made her professional instincts twitch. What pirates? We're 3 days from the nearest shipping lane and 5 days from any inhabited system. Did they follow us out here, just on the off chance they might find some teenage Velnari to kidnap? Perhaps, Commander Gaxmol rumbled, his tail lashing behind him. My cubs are the offspring of a high-ranking military commander. They would be valuable hostages. Valuable to who? Zephyr pressed. What's the market for adolescent alien nobles? Who's going to pay a ransom for kids whose father is currently on a peaceful scientific expedition? The logic was sound, but logic had apparently left the building around the same time the cubs had vanished. The assembled search teams were operating on pure emotion now, and emotion had a tendency to favor dramatic explanations over practical ones. Interdimensional rifts, suggested a Gorvani engineer with the kind of academic enthusiasm that suggested this was their favorite theory. Spontaneous quantum displacement events are rare, but not impossible. The cubs could have been transported to an alternate dimensional phase. Right, Zephyr said slowly. Interdimensional rifts. Because that's definitely more likely than 2 teenagers going for a walk. But her sarcasm was lost in the growing excitement as more theories emerged. Temporal anomalies, experimental teleportation technology, hostile artificial intelligences. Each suggestion was more elaborate than the last, and each one was received with the kind of serious consideration usually reserved for peer-reviewed scientific papers. Zephyr pulled out her scanner again and stepped away from the crowd. While everyone else was chasing ghosts and theoretical physics, she had noticed something that apparently no one else found interesting. The biosignatures were still there. Faint, yes. Difficult to pinpoint, absolutely. But present. She adjusted the sensitivity settings and began a slow sweep of the corridor. The readings were inconsistent, jumping between barely detectable and completely absent in a pattern that didn't make any sense if the cubs were moving around. But if they were stationary? How long have they been missing? She asked Dr. Umbra. Approximately 6 hours, the scientist replied without looking up from her displays. Commander Gaxmol checked on them before the night cycle began, and they were in their quarters. The morning alarm found them gone. 6 hours. Long enough for 2 scared teenagers to find a hiding spot and fall asleep. Long enough for their biosignatures to settle into a steady, low-energy pattern that the ship's sensors might interpret as background noise. Zephyr expanded her scan range and began walking slowly down the corridor. The readings fluctuated, but there was a definite trend. Stronger toward the residential sections, weaker toward the command areas. not random wandering, purposeful movement toward a specific destination. "Dr. Umbra," she called out, "what do we know about Velnari's sleeping patterns?" "Sleeping patterns?" The scientist looked up, blinking as if the question had come from another galaxy. "What does that have to do with finding them?" "Humor me." Dr. Umbra accessed her files with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to random requests for obscure information. Velnari adolescents require approximately 10 hours of sleep per day. They prefer warm, enclosed spaces and typically sleep in family groups for security and warmth. Their sleep cycles are deeper than most species. Once asleep, they're difficult to wake unless there's immediate danger. "And they've been missing for 6 hours, Zephyr mused, which means if they found somewhere comfortable to sleep, they could still be asleep," Dr. Umbra finished, her eyes widening. "That's why the biosignatures are so faint. They're in deep sleep mode." Commander Gaxmol's head snapped toward them, his predator instincts focusing on the new information with laser precision. "You believe my cubs are sleeping somewhere on the ship?" "I believe your cubs got scared, went looking for somewhere that felt safe, and curled up for a nap," Zephyr said. "The question is where they would go. Somewhere warm, somewhere that smells familiar, somewhere that reminds them of home." The search teams had gone quiet, everyone straining to hear the conversation. Even the Threx drones had stopped their incessant clicking. "The Velnari quarters are the warmest section of the ship," Lieutenant Vora pointed out. "If they wanted warmth, why leave?" "Because warm isn't the same as safe," Zephyr replied, "and familiar isn't the same as comforting." She was thinking out loud now, following a chain of logic that was based more on instinct than evidence. Two scared kids, far from home, looking for somewhere to sleep. Where would they go? What would make them feel secure? The answer, when it came to her, was so obvious she almost laughed out loud. They wouldn't look for somewhere that smelled like home. They would look for somewhere that smelled like safety. And on a ship full of diplomatic aliens who spent their time being polite and careful around each other, there was only one scent that would register as safe to a pair of young predators. They would look for something that smelled like the strongest, most confident predator they could find. Zephyr's scanner was pointing steadily toward the human quarters now, the readings growing stronger with each step. She should have realized it sooner. The cubs had been following her around during her maintenance rounds for the past few days, watching her work with the kind of fascination that teenagers usually reserved for Hollywood stars. She had assumed it was simple curiosity about human engineering techniques. It had never occurred to her that she might smell like safety to a couple of homesick alien kids. "I know where they are," she said quietly. The corridor erupted in a storm of questions, but Zephyr was already walking, her scanner leading her toward a revelation that was going to surprise everyone, especially her. The human quarters section of the Nexus Dawn was a testament to practical engineering and complete disregard for aesthetic appeal. Where other species had requested environmental modifications, cultural accommodations, and specific atmospheric compositions, humans had basically shrugged and said, "Standard life support is fine, thanks. Maybe throw in some extra coffee dispensers." Zephyr's quarters were located in the middle of the human residential block, sandwiched between Engineer Watson's perpetually messy workshop and communications specialist Liu's impeccably organized living space. The contrast said everything you needed to know about human adaptability. Stick a dozen humans in identical spaces, and you'd get a dozen completely different interpretations of home. Her scanner was practically humming now, the biosignature readings strong enough that she didn't need to check the display. Whatever she was tracking was close. Very close. and completely stationary, which supported her theory about the cubs finding somewhere comfortable to sleep. She palmed the access panel to her quarters, and the door slid open with a soft whisper of pressurized air. The interior was dark, lit only by the soft glow of status indicators and the ambient lighting from the corridor behind her. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. Work clothes draped over a chair, technical manuals scattered across her desk. The vaguely organized chaos that happened when someone spent more time fixing other people's problems than organizing their own space. The scanner's readings spiked. Zephyr stepped into the room and let the door close behind her, sealing out the ambient noise from the corridor. In the sudden quiet, she could hear something that made her shake her head in amazement. Purring. Deep, rumbling, contented purring that sounded like a perfectly tuned engine running at idle. It was coming from the direction of her sleeping area, and it was definitely not human. She activated the room's lighting to minimum levels, just enough to see without being blinding to anyone who might be sleeping. The soft illumination revealed her quarters in their usual state of controlled disorder, with one notable exception. Her bunk, a standard-issue sleeping platform that had all the comfort and aesthetic appeal of a cargo container, was occupied. Two forms were curled together under her work jacket, forming a perfect ball of golden fur and synchronized breathing. Wicks and Flux had somehow managed to wedge themselves onto the narrow sleeping surface in a configuration that defied both physics and common sense, but which looked undeniably comfortable. Wicks, the larger of the two, was curled around his sister protectively, his tail draped over both of them like a furry blanket. Flux had her face buried against what appeared to be Zephyr's spare work shirt, and both cubs were producing the kind of deep, satisfied purring that spoke of complete contentment. Zephyr stood in the doorway of her own sleeping area, staring at two alien teenagers who had apparently decided that her bunk was the safest place on a ship full of trained diplomats, scientists, and security personnel. "Well," she said quietly, "this is definitely going in the maintenance log." The cubs didn't stir. Whatever dreams they were having, they were clearly more interesting than reality. Zephyr pulled out her scanner for confirmation, and the readings were unmistakable. Two healthy Velnari adolescents in deep sleep, completely unharmed, and radiating the kind of biosignature that suggested they hadn't been this relaxed since boarding the ship. The logical thing to do would be to contact Commander Gaxmol immediately. The cubs were safe, the crisis was over, and everyone could go back to their regular duties with another amusing story to tell about the quirks of interspecies travel. Instead, Zephyr found herself settling into her desk chair and studying the sleeping aliens with professional curiosity. How exactly had they ended up here? Her quarters weren't particularly easy to access. The human section was on the opposite end of the ship from the Velnari delegation areas, and getting here would have required navigating several security checkpoints and at least two major corridor intersections. More importantly, why here? What had made two scared teenagers bypass dozens of other potential hiding spots to end up in her personal space? She activated her personal terminal and pulled up the ship's internal monitoring logs. The corridors were equipped with basic motion sensors and atmospheric monitors, nothing invasive enough to violate privacy, but sufficient to track general movement patterns. If the cubs had made their way from their quarters to hers, there should be a trail. The data was scattered, but telling. Two small biosignatures departing the Velnari quarters approximately 6 hours ago. Movement through the main corridors, pausing at several intersections as if the travelers were unsure of their destination. A brief stop near the mess hall, then more purposeful movement toward the human residential section. But the interesting part was the timeline. The cubs hadn't come straight to her quarters. They had spent nearly 2 hours wandering through different sections of the ship before ending up here. 2 hours of searching for something specific, testing different locations, rejecting options that didn't meet whatever criteria they were using. Zephyr cross-referenced the movement data with her own duty logs from the previous few days. The pattern that emerged was so obvious, she was surprised she hadn't seen it before. Every location the cubs had visited during their wandering was somewhere she had been working recently. The power junction near the mess hall where she had repaired a failing converter. The environmental control station in the midship corridor where she had recalibrated the atmospheric processors. The maintenance access panel near the observation deck where she had replaced a faulty sensor array. They hadn't been randomly exploring. They had been following her scent trail through the ship, tracking her recent activities like bloodhounds following a trail. And when that trail led them to her quarters, they had apparently decided they had found what they were looking for. The realization should have been disturbing. 2 alien predators had essentially stalked her through the ship's corridors and broken into her private space. Instead, Zephyr found herself oddly touched. In a ship full of adults who were trying very hard to be diplomatic and non-threatening, she was apparently the one who smelled like safety to a pair of homesick kids. "What exactly do you think I smell like?" she asked the sleeping cubs softly. The answer came to her as she watched Flux unconsciously nuzzle deeper into her spare work shirt. It wasn't about what she smelled like, it was about what that scent represented. Confidence, competence, the kind of steady, unflappable presence that didn't panic when things went wrong and didn't back down when faced with problems. To adult minds, those were professional qualities. To young predators operating on instinct, they were the markers of a pack leader. Someone strong enough to protect the group, stable enough to provide security, and trustworthy enough to sleep near, without worry. Zephyr had somehow managed to register as the alpha predator on a ship full of actual predators, simply by being good at her job and refusing to be intimidated by anything. The irony was not lost on her. A soft chime from her terminal indicated an incoming communication request. The display showed Commander Gaxmol's identification, and the priority level suggested he was not in the mood for delays. Zephyr glanced at the sleeping cubs, then back at the communication alert. Time to wake the kids and face the music. But first, she had some questions of her own. She leaned forward and spoke in a voice just loud enough to penetrate the cubs' sleep without startling them. "Hey, Wix Flux! Time to wake up!" The purring stuttered, then stopped entirely. 2 pairs of emerald eyes opened slowly, blinking in the dim light. For a moment, both cubs looked confused, as if they couldn't quite remember where they were or how they had gotten there. Then Flux spotted Zephyr sitting a few feet away, and her expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been embarrassment, mixed with relief. "Human Zephyr," she said in carefully pronounced standard. Her voice was higher than her father's, but carried the same underlying growl. We were looking for somewhere safe to sleep," Zephyr finished. "I figured that out. The question is why you thought my quarters were safer than your own." Wix sat up slowly, his golden fur sticking up in tufts that made him look younger than his considerable size suggested. "Your scent," he said simply. "It smells like strength, like safety, like pack leader." "Pack leader," Zephyr repeated. "Right. And you decided to adopt me without asking?" Both cubs looked at each other, then back at her. Flux's tail twitched nervously. "We were afraid," she admitted quietly. "Everything smells wrong here, sounds wrong, feels wrong. But you smell right. You smell like someone who would protect the pack." Zephyr's terminal chimed again, more insistently this time. Commander Gaxmol was clearly not going away. "Well," she said, standing up and stretching muscles that had gone stiff from sitting still, "I suppose we should go tell your father that his cubs weren't kidnapped by interdimensional pirates after all." The cubs exchanged another look, this one tinged with something that might have been guilt. "He is angry," Wicks said. It wasn't a question. "He's terrified," Zephyr corrected. "There's a difference. Angry he could handle. Terrified is what happens when someone you love disappears and you don't know if they're safe." She walked over to her storage locker and pulled out a spare jacket, noting with amusement that the one the cubs had been sleeping under probably now carried enough of their scent to be considered pack property. "Come on," she said, heading toward the door. "Let's go fix this before your father decides to tear the ship apart looking for you." But as the three of them left her quarters, together, two alien teenagers flanking her like bodyguards, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated than a simple case of homesick kids looking for a comfortable place to sleep. After all, if two Velnari cubs had decided she was pack leader material, what exactly did that make her responsible for? She had a sinking suspicion she was about to find out. The walk from Zephyr's quarters to the main corridor felt like the longest diplomatic mission in galactic history. Wicks and Flux flanked her on either side, their previous confidence replaced by the universal expression of teenagers who suddenly realized they might be in serious trouble. Their ears were flattened against their heads, and their tails dragged behind them with the enthusiasm of deflated balloons. "Your father isn't going to eat me, is he?" Zephyr asked conversationally as they approached the intersection where the search teams were still coordinating their increasingly frantic efforts. "Velnari do not consume sentient beings," Flux replied, with the kind of literal-minded seriousness that only teenagers could manage in tense situations. "That wasn't really what I was worried about," Zephyr muttered. The moment they rounded the corner into the main corridor, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The clicking of Threx drones ceased mid-buzz. The subsonic humming of Gorvani echolocation cut off, as if someone had thrown a switch. Even the ship's background noise seemed to pause in collective amazement. Commander Gaxmol was standing in the center of the makeshift command center, his massive frame rigid with tension as he studied yet another sensor readout that showed absolutely nothing useful. His golden fur had darkened to deep amber with stress, and his claws were extended just enough to score marks in the deck plating where he gripped it. Then he looked up. The transformation was instant and breathtaking. 6 hours of barely contained panic melted away in a single moment, replaced by relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. His ears snapped forward, his tail went rigid, and his entire posture shifted from predatory tension to protective alertness. "Wicks, Flux." His voice carried none of the commanding authority he used with other crew members. This was pure parental concern, wrapped in the kind of gentleness that most people never got to see from the warrior species. "My cubs, where have you been?" Both cubs looked at their feet, their ears flattening further. It was Wicks who finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were scared, Father." Commander Gaxmol crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee so he could examine his offspring at eye level. His hands, capable of tearing through hull plating, touched their faces with infinite care, checking for injuries that everyone already knew weren't there. "Scared of what?" he asked softly. "Your quarters were secure, comfortable, safe. What could frighten you there?" Flux glanced at Zephyr, then back at her father. "Everything smells wrong here," she said quietly. "Sounds wrong. The air moves wrong. We could not sleep. We kept thinking about home, about our mother, about the pack. And then we smelled—" She trailed off, looking uncertain about how to explain something that was based entirely on instinct and adolescent logic. "They smelled me," Zephyr said, stepping forward slightly. The entire corridor full of search teams was listening now, and she was acutely aware that whatever she said next was going to become part of official diplomatic records. "Apparently, I smell like someone who could protect them." Commander Gaxamol's gaze shifted to her, his emerald eyes studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Except this time, there was something else in that gaze. Something that might have been respect, mixed with profound confusion. "You smell like pack leader to them," he said. It wasn't a question, but his tone suggested he was having trouble processing the concept. "So, they tell me," Zephyr replied. "Apparently, confidence and competence translate across species lines." "But you are human," Commander Gaxmol said, as if this explained some fundamental impossibility. "Humans are soft, peaceful. You do not hunt. You do not fight for dominance. You do not establish pack hierarchy through combat trials." The assembled crowd of aliens was listening with the kind of fascination usually reserved for first contact scenarios. Dr. Umbra had actually pulled out a recording device and was documenting the entire conversation for what would undoubtedly become the most interesting xenological paper of the year. "No," Zephyr agreed, "we don't do any of those things. We just fix problems that need fixing, make decisions when decisions need making, and keep working when everyone else is panicking. Apparently, that's enough." Wicks looked up at his father with the earnest expression of someone trying to explain something vitally important. When the air recyclers failed in the engineering section, human Zephyr crawled into the maintenance shaft, while the Threx drones said it was too dangerous. When the gravitational fluctuation made everyone nervous, she went to the core alone to recalibrate the generators. She does not show fear. She does not ask others to face dangers she will not face herself. "And she smells like safety," Flux added, "like someone strong enough to protect the pack, wise enough to make good decisions, calm enough to handle problems without panic." Commander Gaxmol stood slowly, his gaze never leaving Zephyr's face. "My cubs have claimed you as pack leader," he said quietly. "This is unprecedented." "Tell me about it," Zephyr muttered. "I was just trying to keep the ship running." "In Velnari culture," Commander Gaxmol continued, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone explaining sacred traditions, "the pack leader is chosen not through combat, but through demonstration of protective strength. The ability to provide safety, security, guidance. To be claimed as pack leader by cubs who are not your own offspring is—" He paused, searching for words in Standard that could convey concepts that had probably never been translated before. "Honored," Dr. Umbra supplied helpfully from her position behind the recording equipment. "Deeply honored, if I'm reading the cultural context correctly." "Beyond honored," Commander Gaxmol confirmed. "It is recognition of the highest order. To be chosen as pack leader means you are seen as worthy of protecting the most precious members of the community. It means my cubs trust you with their lives." The corridor had gone completely silent. Even the Threx drones had stopped their perpetual motion, hovering motionless in the air like organic sculptures. The weight of what had just been revealed was settling over everyone like a particularly heavy blanket. Zephyr looked down at Wicks and Flux, who were watching her with the kind of hopeful expectation that suggested they had no idea they had just made her responsible for their psychological well-being according to ancient alien traditions. "Right," she said finally. So what exactly does that mean in practical terms? Commander Gaxmol's expression shifted, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. I am not sure, he admitted. This situation has never arisen before. A non-Velnari being accepted as pack leader by Cubs. There are no protocols, no precedents. But there are instincts, Flux said quietly. She stepped closer to Zephyr, close enough that her golden fur brushed against the human's work coveralls. You smell right. You feel safe. When we are near you, we do not worry about being far from home. Wicks nodded agreement, moving to Zephyr's other side. Pack leaders provide security through strength and wisdom. You have both. The ship is safer because you are here. We are safer because you are here. Zephyr found herself flanked by two young aliens who were looking at her as if she had personally hung the stars in their correct positions. The responsibility was simultaneously flattering and terrifying. Okay, she said, with the kind of practical acceptance that had gotten her through every other impossible situation in her career. I guess I'm a pack leader now. What do pack leaders do? Commander Gaxamol's expression softened, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his emerald eyes. They provide guidance, protection, and security for their pack members. They make decisions when the pack faces uncertainty. They ensure the safety and well-being of those under their care. So basically the same things I was already doing, Zephyr said. Except now it's official, and it involves alien teenagers instead of malfunctioning machinery. The principles are similar, Commander Gaxmol agreed, though I suspect the maintenance requirements may be somewhat different. The corridor erupted in what could only be described as relieved laughter. The tension that had gripped the entire ship for the past 6 hours finally broke, replaced by the kind of warm amusement that came from realizing that the universe was both more complicated and more wonderful than anyone had expected. Well, Dr. Umbra announced, powering down her recording equipment, this is definitely going to require some new diplomatic protocols. Zephyr looked down at her new pack members, who had somehow managed to position themselves so they were both touching her. Wicks's shoulder against her arm, Flux's hand resting lightly on her sleeve. They were purring again, the deep, contented sound that spoke of complete security and trust. I suppose this means I'm responsible for making sure you two don't disappear again, she said. Pack leaders do not lose pack members, Wicks confirmed solemnly. Right. No pressure or anything. Zephyr shook her head, but she was smiling. Come on, let's get you back to your quarters. Your father probably wants to have a long talk with both of you about the proper protocols for adopting humans. As they walked away together, three figures who had accidentally created something entirely new in the history of interspecies relations, the assembled search teams began the process of powering down their equipment and returning to normal duties. But throughout the ship, word was already spreading about the human engineer who had somehow become a pack leader to alien cubs simply by being good at her job. And in the days that followed, as other young members of various species began gravitating toward the humans who displayed similar qualities of calm competence and unshakable reliability, it became clear that Zephyr's experience was not unique. Humans, it turned out, had a talent for making other species feel safe. Not through strength or combat prowess, but through the simple act of remaining steady when everything else was falling apart. It was, the diplomatic corps would later note, a rather useful talent to have in a galaxy full of uncertainties, even if it did come with the occasional responsibility of serving as a security blanket for homesick alien teenagers.